name is Gervais. I am the CEO of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, and I am pleased to welcome you today to the first of a series of 4 video conferences on the investment environment for agri-food research and innovation, put together by the Agri-Food Innovation Council. We're happy to have all of you attending today, and we're happy to have great panelists that will be discussing this issue today, next week, the following week, and again in early December. Question to note, Mr. Tom Rosser from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada communicated with us late yesterday to let us know that he was not going to be able to attend today due to another issue at his office. Therefore, Mr. Rosser will not be in attendance today. Just to let you know, all attendees have been muted upon entry into the webinar. We are using the Q&A option, which is found at the bottom right of your screen during the presentation and moderated discussion to provide attendees the opportunity to ask questions. If you see a question posed by another participant that you like, you may upvote the question in order to move it up in the queue. During the general Q&A period, we ask that you click the raise hand button found next to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen so that we can allow you to be heard. It is necessary to unmute yourself once given the permission to speak is granted by the host. Again, we welcome our panelists today. A reminder that Mr. Rosser will not be with us today, and therefore our Vice Chair, Tania Humphrey, who is the moderator of the session, will also take a more active role during the session. I would like now to invite Dr. Julianne Curran, the chair of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, to say a few words.
Thank you, Serge, and hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in the first of 4 video conferences organized by the Agri-Food Innovation Council. For the past 100 years, AIC has provided leadership in its efforts to advocate on behalf of agri-food research and innovation. We are focused on the development of policies and advocacy at the national level. Today, AIC is led by a board of directors from various parts of the sector. I am the VP of Market Innovation at Pulse Canada and the chair of AIC's board of directors. My colleague, Tania Humphrey, is VP of Research and Development at Vineland. Our other colleagues represent different parts of the sector and hail from most regions of Canada. The membership of AIC includes national, provincial, and regional organizations, companies, industry associations, academic institutions, and government organizations interested in policies related to agri-food research and innovation have joined AIC to help shape, support, and accompany our efforts to support a strong Canadian presence in the field. If you have not done so, I encourage you to join AIC to participate in the discussion, help us develop sound policies, and strengthen our voice. As more focus is placed on food production, food safety, and food security, there have been global efforts to increase investments in agri-food research and innovation. In Canada, this includes government, academia, and the private sector. The intent in this series of video conferences is to identify how policies could support the development of a stronger investment system in our sector's research and innovation system. I would now like to recognize some of our sponsors: Ag Expert, Canadian Science Publishing, Protein Industries Canada, and MyTax. At this time, I'd like to invite Krista Kilback, Manager of Marketing and Sales for Ag Expert, to say a few words in recognition of their Platinum partnership.
Hi, thanks. It's so great to be part of this AIC event that's kicking off today. So as you mentioned, my name is Krista Kilback, and I work at Farm Credit Canada as a manager for Ag Expert. So I'm just going to really quickly speak about the value that, planning brings to Canadian farmers, especially as farm data grows in quantity and scope, and how keeping records can really help producers make better business decisions for their operations. So Ag Expert provides producers a way to keep digital records with both an accounting and a field management tool. And we really did design Ag Expert, with Canadian agriculture in mind. So both platforms are available to all producers in all provinces in every ag and food sector. And we really want to make, keeping as simple and as easy as possible. So that means producers can enter, access, and share information anywhere at any time with anyone, with both the software, the accounting, and the field software. So this really allows producers to manage their time, determine when it works for them best to enter information, and really to be able to learn key information about their operations year over year. So really through that good record keeping, which is a practice, comes good practices. And it takes that guesswork out of remembering operating decisions that were made in the past. The one thing I want to mention too is Ag Expert is also the first software in Canada to be ag data transparent, which means farmers' data is protected to the highest standards. So in short, when farmers have great bookkeeping and great information, they're likely to use and make decisions based on that data, which really allows them to see a complete picture of the farm, feeling confident in decisions, and just making better informed decisions overall. So with that, I just want to thank you for the time today. I'm looking forward to this great event and hearing from all the speakers. And if you do want, additional information, you can visit us at agexpert.ca.
Thanks, Krista, and thanks again to Ag Expert for their platinum sponsorship. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Tania Humphrey, who is going to moderate the session.
Thank you, Julianne. So everyone, thanks once again for joining us today, and a special welcome to our speakers today. So we have, first up, we have JP Gervais, who is the Vice President and Chief Agricultural Economist of Farm Credit Canada. Mr. Gervais has over 20 years of experience analysing domestic and international agricultural policies and markets. He is FCC's spokesperson on economic matters and provides commentary on the agriculture industry. We also have joining us Andrew Schrumm, Senior Manager of Research, RBC Thought Leadership. Mr. Schrumm has authored many key pieces, including the 2019 RBC report, Farmer 4.0, which examined the technology-driven growth and emerging skills needs in agricultural production. So first, I'd like to call on each of these speakers to say a few words, and then we're going to go through some preset questions for them. And then after that, the audience will have an opportunity to pose some questions themselves. So first, JP.
Okay, well, thank you, Tania. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to AIC as well for the invite. It's great to be part of the conference. Looking forward to a great discussion. Now, it's quite a bit of pressure in kicking things off, for sure. If I go back to the session and the intent behind the session, which is to set the stage around the importance of investment, research, and innovation for agri-food. So I thought, well, I'd focus my remarks on what I've learned over the last few years and some of the thoughts that we've developed at FCC around the industry, and really what are the critical success factors if we think of the future. Right? And I don't think, not knowing exactly who's attending the event, and by the way, thank you for all of those that are tuning in live to this session, not knowing exactly, I would suspect that I don't have to do a whole lot of convincing to tell you about, or to convince you that the industry that we're in, the entire agri-food supply chain, is absolutely critical to the success of not only our industry, but the Canadian overall economy, right? So just some well-known facts about the industry. We're the 5th largest exporter of ag commodities in the world. We're the 11th largest exporter of food. If we try to understand the importance of the agri-food supply chain for the overall Canadian economy, while you think of the US, for example, right? If thinking of population between Canada and the US, the ratio is 10 to 1. Thinking about the overall size of the economy in the US, not just ag food, but really the overall economy in the US relative to the overall economy in Canada, well, the ratio is about 12 to 1. If you focus on our industry and our supply chain, right, at the farm level, a measure of success would be, for example, farm cash receipts or income at the farm level. The ratio now between the US and Canada is 6-1. So we shrunk the ratio, right? Just highlighting again the importance of the sector for us. If you get food manufacturing is the largest manufacturing sector in Canada. In the US, it's the 8th largest manufacturing sector, right? So again, just speaking to the importance of the sector, the supply chain for the overall economy. I mean, we're a big deal, right? Again, just the GDP of the entire agri-food supply chain, a full 100 basis points higher in Canada than it is in the US. So just like we're a big deal, and we've had quite a bit of success. The thing is, though, I mean, there's quite a bit of evidence as well that correlates, quite overwhelming evidence, I should say, emphasize, quite a bit of evidence that correlates innovation and economic well-being. No matter what, what kind of variables you want to use to measure well-being, whether it's profits, income at the aggregate level, GDP, which is sort of the measure that economists, people like me, tend to focus on. Whatever you want to use to measure economic well-being, there's quite a bit of evidence that correlates innovation and well-being. And there are plenty of different factors, I would say, that explain why we've had success in the industry. But let me focus on one, and that's productivity. If you look at our pattern of productivity at the farm level in Canada, going all the way back 50 years, I mean, the data set that most would use would be coming from the USDA. It's called total factor productivity, so TFP for short. It's the idea that, how much are you able to increase your production by not doing it by increasing inputs, by just finding efficiencies, technical progress, and so forth, making your inputs basically more productive, right? So you try to highlight, the ability to increase production while minimizing the increases in inputs that you need to use to increase that production, right? Our TFP, total factor productivity, if you have to account for this over periods of 10 years because you need to account for weather disruptions and so forth. But if you look at decade after decade, I mean, we were doing really great, right? Our productivity on an annual basis was overall growing at the farm level by more than 2%. At some point, I believe it was 2.85. But we're starting to slow down our rate of growth in productivity. So we still are more productive, for sure. But that speed at which, we're growing our productivity is slowing down. In other words, what I like to say is the low-hanging fruits are gone, right? We need to step up our game when it comes to research and development, investment, innovation. Because again, the evidence is so overwhelming in terms of the success we've had and what is driving that success. As I said, there are many multiple factors, but innovation, productivity is definitely one of the most critical ones. And so, I think the discussion today, as I see it, or some of the things that I'd like to point out, throughout the webinar would be like, what are the things that will make us successful? What are the things that, if we're setting bold objectives, right, in terms of our export presence in world markets, the idea that we're going to grow our food and agricultural exports and leapfrog some of the countries in terms of their importance in the overall global ag and food market. If we think of ourselves as world leaders, what needs to happen to be really successful doing so? And so I'll just leave it at that. I really hope that, some of the statistics and numbers that I've used are making the case, quite a convincing case, in my opinion, that we need to account for the framework, the drivers of investment, innovation, and overall research and development. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Gervais, for some insightful comments there. So our next speaker, Andrew Schrumm, would you like to offer some comments of your own?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Tania. And thank you, Serge and AIC for the invitation to join you today. So as Tania mentioned, I work at RBC in our thought leadership group. There we're focused on examining the big shifts in innovation, diversity, and human capital that can lead to prosperity among all Canadians. So in that, I lead our Humans Wanted project, which examines the labor dynamics of digital transformation across the economy. And as Tania mentioned, we released the Farmer 4.0 report last year that really emphasized the need for greater innovation in agriculture to meet the productivity challenge in light of an aging workforce and changing consumer demand. So I guess similar to JP, some of the things I want to convey here, my two main points off the top is that agriculture is entering a decade of great transformation, both with the rise of new technology, but also a massive demographic shift among those who support the sector. And second, and as a result, innovation is critical, certainly through new capital, new products and markets. But the only way to secure lasting return on the investments here is by building the needed skills at the farm level to adapt to changing practices, machinery, and data utilization. So JP and I probably came from a very similar starting point in today's conversation, and I wanted also to talk about productivity and really celebrate that the industry of the last 20 years has been the champion across the Canadian economy. And far too much, we don't celebrate that enough, and we should. And it's done so by adopting machinery at 4 times the rate of the rest of the Canadian economy, as its workforce has shrunk by about 1/3. Output, though, continues to grow thanks to the innovative sector that isn't afraid to try new things despite the risks. Yet we're starting to see a stalling of these trends. First, in 2018 and 2019, the sector added cumulatively about 16,000 jobs. And despite the global pandemic, the agricultural sector has added jobs this year. But the demand for workers is changing, but it's growing, but it's also changing within the skills mix needed to interact with new scientific practices and new technology. But more critical, those productivity gains, as JP was outlining, are very much slowing, and we see that as very troubling. And some are forecasting it to drop to about 1/3 of the rates it has been over the last 20 years. That would put the industry at about what the trucking sector has done since 2000 and could slow our GDP growth and overall our recovery. These realities put producers in a position of having to produce more with even less and to compete in an ever-changing global trade market. So to get us there, we believe we need to focus on both the skills and the technological innovation in the sector. At RBC, our economists consider the effect of lower productivity expectations and prolonged job vacancies together. The good news, as we see it, is the sector will continue to grow on its current trajectory, but at a more modest, about 1.7% annually. But if we're able to fill all the job vacancies incrementally over the next decade, we conclude that we could see another $3 billion added in output by 2030. But the real lever there is how we can increase productivity through innovation. If we can return to our recent 10-year average of in the neighborhood of 3% productivity gains annually, we could see another $8 billion. So put those together, accelerating the adoption of innovative technologies and embracing an ambitious skills agenda, we estimate another $11 billion could be added to the primary agricultural sector over the next decade. So we believe in Canada, there's no country better place to do this. We have many natural advantages, but we also have a strong entrepreneurial spirit among our agricultural leaders. What this means, however, is that the food industry is rapidly becoming part of the knowledge economy, which may be a bit counterculture. So in our paper, we tried to set out some different skills groups that would help to navigate and encourage everyone to read the report if they have time. But among there, we highlighted 2 of the emerging skills groups that are really dependent on the success of the sector of embracing technology at the farm level. So the first of which are the enablers, who we see as the engineers, electricians, and computer technicians, who really represent the skill set needed to bring that new technology and productivity enhancing practices to the farm level. Over the next decade, you're going to see about 25,000 of these roles across the sector, and it's the fastest growing segment. The other segment we have outlined in our paper are the specialists. These are the knowledge-based workers, the plant scientists, the regulatory experts, the animal geneticists, who are contributing analysis and expertise to improve processes and productivity and well-being. But the risk here, as what we're seeing, is a projected about 1 in 4 of those jobs are having trouble being filled. So to be able to capture the innovative gains, we also see this importance of adding these skill sets to the farm level. And to fill these pipeline to ensure youth and educators are aware of these roles that require specialized knowledge across the industry. So boiled down, I guess my point is that innovation needs adopters to get it going and the specialists to make it last. So we've got some ideas about how to make that happen, and I'm thrilled to chat about that through the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew and JP, both for some insightful comments. Now, I find it interesting that you both chose to highlight productivity gains, and both mentioned how productivity gains have been enormous throughout history, but that it's slowing down. So before we move on to the next questions, I'd just like to explore that a little bit to lay the groundwork and understand a little bit about why you think that may be. Why has productivity slowed down? If you could offer some comment. JP?
Well, you know, we got some challenges ahead of us. I mean, if you look at some of the hurdles, that we have to grow our productivity, I mean, labor is definitely one of those, right? If you compare where Canada is in terms of the share of labor in overall agricultural production, we're one of the highest countries in terms of our share of labor costs, and so that puts us at a disadvantage if we still have the mindset that labor is going to drive a whole lot of our productivity gains. I think we also have to understand where we're coming from. I think where we're heading is a function of where we're coming from. I don't, I think there's consensus right now that productivity, the trends that we're seeing for productivity are slowing down. As I think that's, Andrew and what you said, Tania, actually is pretty much, establishing a sort of consensus for this panel that, we're stuck in that environment and we need to get going again. And as I said, the low-hanging fruits are gone. I mean, we're going to have to be really aggressive, not only in setting objectives in terms of sort of the targets that we need to reach in terms of exports by over the next 10 years and so. They're very, very useful as well, just to keep an eye on the progress we're making. But as well as we're going to have to be bold in terms of how we're seeing innovation getting through the supply chain and generating innovation that can lead to productivity. We got some really good examples that we can discuss later on, but I do think that it requires a change of mindset in the overall environment, lifting some of the hurdles that exist for innovation. If you think of one of the factors that's mentioned most often is definitely regulations. So I think there are a number of different things that we can do and that we're going to address throughout to bring more innovation and to shift the trend that we've experienced and recorded in the last 10 years with regards to productivity.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, JP. Andrew?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. I think in many ways, the easy work has been done. Not to say that it's been easy, but the road ahead will be challenging. You think about parts of the industry that has been able to, what I mentioned about machinery adoption. There's many parts of the industry that they can't do that yet because of the difficult nature of harvesting and so on. But what I also think, and when we talk to our clients across the bank, is that there's a great interest in what's next, a great interest in doing what's new. There's also that huge capital that's required for adoption, to take on new strategies, new staff, new practices, new computer platforms, at a time when the lifespan of that new technology could be quite short. So there is this interest I've observed across our clients to be ready for what's next, but being afraid of being locked in to a new practice, a new seed variety, a new machinery, or so on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. So we'll move to our next questions here. And Andrew, maybe I'll invite you this time to speak first. On the first question, are investments in agri-food research and innovation bearing fruits? Can you think of some key successes?
Yeah, so I think a very similar outlook as what we just discussed. So in our paper, we looked at kind of the human-machine relationship across agriculture, and we looked at it between the subsectors. And what we found were two extremes among business types. For example, as you know well, in greenhouses, you can see on the labor spend, for every dollar in labor, you see about $3.50 in revenue. While on the other extreme, you see for beef feedlots, that same dollar invested in people nets about $34 in revenue. So almost a tenfold increase across the sectors. There's a wide variety in how people and machines are being used differently. And that being said, there's no uniform approach across agriculture to innovative practices and data and technology. So just diving there a little bit more, at one of the spectrum, tech and machinery has been taken hold. Again, that very much that machinery story that we've talked about already. There you find grains and beef, where it's a 4-to-1 ratio of spending on machines to people. And as we look ahead, how these segments drive growth and higher yield will be through digitization and data management. Then on the other end of the extreme, where you find more spending on human labor, our horticulture and other fruits and vegetable production, which remain the most human intensive segment. The next stages there, we'll see more robotics, more indoor and controlled environments, and yes, still more data management. So by this framework, the keys to success really depend on the readiness of technology. So on again, those two dynamics for group beef and grain, combining automated feeding machines will make a huge difference. And in the greenhouse space, the fine movement of hand and judgment required by human intervention, that tech is still evolving.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And so I think it's the onus is on me then to offer some comments here about specifically to note that agriculture is inherently a biologically based system. And I think throughout history, a large proportion of our productivity gains has been through biological approaches, particularly with respect to plant genetics. You know, we think about the Green Revolution, but even some of the advances today hinge on the biology of the system. So I think, you know, labor productivity and machinery is obviously needed and an important part of the conversation, but the biological side of things, certainly our own organization, we're always trying to marry those two concepts together. But the gains that can be achieved through genetics, breeding, and other biological approaches, I think are important to keep in mind. So JP, do you have thoughts?
Well, yes. I mean, I just to pick up where you both left off, right? Andrew was talking about equipment. I mean, on a tech side, I can think of lots of examples where we had some success, right? I mean, there is, I'm aware when a mobile diesel powered platform designed to handle a large variety of implements commonly used in agriculture, right? And so that, with the driverless power drills or air drills, and the various different technology that is focused on giving farmers the time to spend more time on the overall operation of their farm, right? We say in business, right, focusing on the business versus in the business. I mean, the idea of shifting the mindset to a CEO type mentality at the farm level, I think is critical for the success of not only innovating, but implementing innovations, adopting and implementing and so forth. And so on the ag tech side, lots of innovation, lots of success. I mean, more to come for sure. You were talking, Tania, about technology with regards to the agronomics or at the plant-based level. And really, there's technology as well with regards to high efficiency fertilizer, biologics, growth promotants that work well, has provided some positive grower returns. And so, these technologies are focused on how to strengthen the plant to make better use of existing nutrients in the ground and how to improve the ground immediately surrounding the root system of the plant. So that again is an area where I think there's lots of room to grow as environmental pressures are increasing when it comes to farming, and better, taking care or better care of the ground actually opens up opportunities, and we've had success already in that field. And I expect that to see more of that than in the next little while here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very good. So how do you think the return of investment in agriculture compares to other sectors?
That's actually a really interesting question. When I started my career in academia, it was more than 20 years ago. That was a hot area of research. I remember there was a seminal paper that was done at the University of California, Berkeley, that was documenting, it was a huge meta-analysis that documented the rate of, or the return on investment, ROIs, across a wide range of different sectors, countries, and so forth. It was just not focused strictly on Canada, but really had a global focus. And the early estimates, I just don't remember the specifics, but the early estimates were in that 60% range, right? So quite fast. And the research question, explaining this puzzle that, if we have such high return on investments, why are we not seeing more investments in R&D, right? And so what's getting in the way? Now, a lot of the subsequent literature actually has come down, or has looked at this estimate and brought it down all the way maybe to 10%, you know, and there's quite a bit of debate exactly of this around ROIs, but the reality is that it's still very large. And I think there's still a puzzle that explains as to, you know, why are we not seeing more R&D in ag and food? If you look at Canada and where we stand right now, I mean, overall, if you look at our focus or our resources, both financial resources and human resources invested in R&D, we're, you know, if you look at ourselves versus the rest of the OECD countries, we're right about average. We're a little bit below average when it comes to overall R&D. If you look at food and manufacturing, then that's when I think it becomes interesting, because if you look at food, I got to look at the numbers here just to make sure that, if you look at total manufacturing, we're about, in terms of resources invested in R&D relative to value added in a sector, just, so making the different sizes of the countries that we're comparing to just roughly equal across each other. We're about 30% or 35% below average when it comes to overall manufacturing. So that's just not food, but it's overall manufacturing R&D. If you look at ag, we're 30% below the OECD average. So some might think, well, this is a public policy issue, and in some ways it very well may be, but it's also, we have to look at the private sector and understand what gets in the way as well. Because if you look at business expenditures, when it comes to food R&D or R&D in the food manufacturing sector, and only focusing on business expenses, not public expenses, we're trailing our competitors. And some, if you think of the Netherlands, for example, which we always like to keep in mind because they're quite innovative, they're doing more than 3 times what we're doing. In the ag space, similar kind of conclusion. I mean, we're lagging our competitors when it comes to business R&D. So there's definitely something in my mind to look at, because we have quite a bit of evidence that establishes some ROIs that are quite significant, and yet there seems to be a gap. So I think that, there is something that we can address later on in this webinar as to what perhaps gets in the way of having more R&D in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Andrew.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting way. I mean, there's no simple measure to really show us where that return is coming from for our investment. It could come from many different ways. So I guess I've gravitated a bit back to where our report tries to think about this, and very much from the labor angle. So when thinking about how other sectors across Canada have taken on innovative practices, have talked about automation, we haven't seen that labor impact in the way that you may have traditionally thought. We haven't, StatsCan came out with a very interesting report last week that showed that firms that were faster at adopting innovation and automation actually saw about a 15% increase over the competitors who didn't on the labor side. So we see that labor retention, see that ability to keep people working, especially in the automotive sector is where that study fell. But the interesting distinction there is that the overall increases came from bumps up in high skilled jobs, such as programmers that need a university degree, but also there's a bit of bifurcation of skills with automation, that you see an increase in low skill workers at the same time. And this is a lesson that we've already seen in agriculture playing out, that as more practices come in, you see that need for higher skill jobs and a need for lower skill jobs at the same time, a bit of that polarization of the skills. So again, we can talk about a bit more if there's interest, but needing those abilities to build those pathways for disrupted workers, that we are not losing that talent and that knowledge from the sector going outward. So again, looking at the comparison of how we are adopting, certainly the last decade or two, of technology across the Canadian industries, we are not seeing that dramatic impact on who's being employed, and firm choice is certainly critical to those successes.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. Now, just to pick up on one of your comments, JP, about Canada lagging behind in business investment in R&D. Certainly, this is something we hear a lot about, and I know in the ag sector, there's a push, a government policy push for increasingly getting the industry themselves to invest directly in research and development. And I know in the horticulture sector, you know, this tends to fall on the shoulders of growers. And certainly in other parts of agriculture, we see the focus is on the farmers. So getting the farmers and the farm associations to invest themselves in R&D. And certainly I think there's an opportunity though in sharing some of that investment. And certainly the agriculture sector is much bigger than just the farmers, you know, that they're a critical piece of it, but the sector is very broad and includes all kinds of players along the whole value chain, you know, all the marketers, wholesale distribution, all of that, but also the input suppliers, the technology companies, who have a role to play in developing, researching, developing new products and technologies that they can then supply to this sector. So can you just speak a bit about that, perhaps the relative importance of farmers versus other players in the sector in investing in R&D?
Well, when I was listening, you were saying, I think you're right on to bring the focus on the entire food supply chain, right? So it's just not a farming issue, it's a food supply or agri-food supply chain issue. And I think we have to have honest conversations now about how we're gonna make sure that innovation and the gains from innovation are fairly distributed across the entire supply chain, right? And as far as, you know, additional costs and just the way that the food sector works and some of the behaviors at the consumption level and the inelasticity of food demand at the consumer level and how it works through the supply chain. I mean, it sometimes pushes costs upward, you know, upstream to farmers. And I do think at the farm level, we have quite a bit of conversations now around how to make sure that we have sustainability, not just from an environmental standpoint, but from a profitability standpoint, right? The sustainability of farming in Canada needs to also include a profitability discussion. And I do think that's related to the innovation or discussions around how to make sure that we properly fund research and development throughout the supply chain and that we distribute the gains. I mean, some of the same issues that I mentioned at the farm level actually apply as well at the food processing level. And so, you know, the entire discussion of research and development and innovation to me is really an industry-wide conversation and not necessarily, as you pointed out, just a farm level conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Andrew, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to think about the, you know, probably numbers we're all quite familiar with, but the global ag tech spending and the sense that that Canada is being outpaced by our key export partners, you know, U.S., China, and India. A couple of years ago, we were only about 3.5% of overall capital being spent in ag tech, which is, you know, surprising. But it also emphasizes the point that we think about how much of our agriculture equipment we buy from abroad. So about 2/3 of the value of our ag equipment comes from overseas. And in a sense, you know, we think about holistically then of the mapping from inception to research to development to innovation, we see that there are skills, training, and even our job descriptions are tied to a technology that's developed elsewhere, affecting, in effect, importing knowledge systems. So, you know, one element to throw in the mix there is to think about the more reliance we have, or the lower reliance we have on a domestic R&D system increases our dependence on foreign IP, which I think is something that that we should be concerned about.
Mm-hmm, definitely. All right, so I'll move to the next question now. So throughout this pandemic that we're in, everyone likes to relate everything back to COVID, but it's still here around us. And we know that food security has been a key issue, especially in the early days. So how do you think that investments in ag food research and innovation can help with this aspect? Andrew, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer to that. I mean, I wish I had. I mean, I think we're seeing a great mobilization around PPE. a great mobilization about trying to reshore some of our manufacturing practices. But I think the question for food is more broad. To think more of food security is more ingrained with our humanity and our livelihood. I'm interested more to see how this goes. As a researcher, we don't have a lot of data to point to yet. Everything's fresh. But I think in the way that we can localize our supply chains more concretely, whether it be, example in Montreal, you see a lot more rooftop farming, you see more CSAs in semi-urban areas. Certainly, I think there's a lot of consumer-driven interest in that sense of trying to have more localized access to our food. So, I think it's a great question to be asked, and maybe not the best answers yet. So.
Okay, JP.
Well, I think it's a fascinating question, frankly. I do think, as Andrew was alluding to, I do think that there is going to be more of a focus on sourcing local, right? So for food processors, it'll be try to localize your supply chain or your supply, so to make sure that, if there are further disruptions, because of this global pandemic or for future events, I mean, there's really an awareness now as to securing supply. And so I think this entire notion or discussion on food security and local, I think, is here to stay. I think, though, that we have a huge opportunity in the industry in shifting the conversation, or part of the conversation, because, let's face it, I mean, we had tons of disruptions because of this pandemic in the food supply chain, and probably going to have some more later on. But I do think that there's a huge opportunity in shifting the narrative to food security and Canada's role in the world in providing food security. Right, we have extremely reliable reputation, stellar reputation when it comes to food safety, high quality food. We're large, we're competitive, we're successful, and I do think that when you think of food security, if you're a large food importer or an importing country, I think you have to do business with Canada, and I think that's an opportunity for us. Because we were talking about raising productivity, right? Increasing innovation, raising productivity. And so if we're able to do that in the context of establishing a bigger footprint in global markets, well, we have a pretty large footprint. But if we're able to establish a larger footprint, and as well engaging partners around food security issues and seeing us as a reliable, trusted, which we are, supplier of food, I think there's an opportunity here to shift the narrative from local, which I'm aware of lots of different initiatives that are absolutely, successful in terms of, connecting consumers with their food supply. And I do think that there's a lot of opportunities there as well. But I think there's a bigger opportunity for us in terms of establishing food security as a goal for the world, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. Food security is a big topic, and most people, I think about the global issues of food security. And certainly, if we do examine it more locally, in Canada, we're lucky enough that food security does not mean starvation like it does in other areas of the world. Food security is, in our inner urban centers, our food desert, low income communities, things like that. But, when I look at it, coming from the horticulture sector, I think food security in Canada is a lot about nutrition. So we have Canada's food guide that says half your plate should be fruits and vegetables. Yet so often the agriculture discussion is focused on our big commodity export crops. But if we really want to ensure that Canadians are getting their fruits and vegetables, and we saw how COVID disrupted the supply chains, fruit and veggies were missing from the shelves in many cases. And so what we really need to do in this regard is make sure we can produce fruit and vegetables in Canada for Canadians. Exports would be an added bonus, but as a minimum, to be able to produce our own fruits and vegetables to ensure Canadians have access to the food and nutrition that they need, we really need to make sure that being a fruit and vegetable farmer in Canada, you can be profitable, sustainable, and competitive. So there's all kinds of ways where science and innovation can help drive that, in that sector, whether it's, automating to reduce the labor challenge, that's obviously a big one, but also new innovations to help optimize production in Canada. You know, we know we don't have the best production environment for growing all kinds of things. We're probably not going to be growing coffee and bananas and things like that, but there's a lot we can do. We can move more crops into the greenhouse. We can breed more crops for production in Canadian short season climates. So there's all kinds of ways in which science and innovation can help to really ensure that we can at least sustain ourselves and produce the full range of nutritious fruits and vegetables, as well as all of the other agricultural crops right here in Canada. Okay, so we'll move on here. So this is a bit of a big question here about what are some of the key trends that each of you have seen? You know, you're both from the finance sector, essentially. So from your perspectives, what are some of the big key trends you've seen? Andrew, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I take this and sorry to keep beating the drum on labor, but you know, I think when we think about these trends, certainly in the sector, we cannot overlook demographics, and certainly when we think about return on investment, when you think about a new seed variety or a milking machine that can reduce physical stress on the farmer, the return is very human, and it being that someone can work in the industry longer, or it can appeal to someone who may not have chosen it. And this is very important when you think about, we have more farmers over the age of 70 than we do under 35. And we continue to see young people choosing careers outside of agri-food. So, you know, I feel like there's very much a twinning effect, these big trends that we try to pull together in our work, of having an understanding of the twinning of technology and demographics, and seeing a movement towards automation, towards more agricultural complex tasks. We also see a large adoption rate among the farming community, among different types. But I think what we really are going to see in the coming years is that data revolution. And I'm sure, Tania, yourself and JP can illustrate it a bit better than I. But what we've seen certainly in the last year, more broadly across the economy, is that data has become permeated everywhere. We write a bit about artificial technology and how prominent it has become when we think about e-commerce. We think about facial recognition technology in the way we're interacting here today. Our faces are traveling everywhere, even when we're not. So we have to come to terms with how we're able across the economy to be leveraging these data insights, and also finding ways to build the skill sets within our farming community who, at last survey I saw, about 40% of farmers don't want to see their data leave the farm gate. And in a sense, we create these data ponds when we should be creating data lakes, and being able to understand these trends that are observable beyond one firm or another across the sector. So those are the two big trends, and I know they're not necessarily newsworthy, but I think we can't lose sight that we have a major shift where 1 in 4 farmers could be out of the sector by the end of the decade, and we need to be finding ways to resolve that.
Mm-hmm. So just to pick up on that, so you've mentioned changing demographics and skill sets a few times. If you were giving advice to a high school student contemplating universities and career choices, what do you think is needed in this sector? What are good career choices and training routes to take that will give the ag innovation space the experts it needs?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think what we've, in a sense, have done over the last 50 years is that we've isolated learning at our institutions in agriculture unto itself. And what we're seeing at institutions like the University of Saskatchewan or SAS Polytech or other innovative institutions is they're trying to break down those walls between what is an ag education and what is a business education or what is a computer science education. And I think the real lever for the sector of attracting people is not necessarily building depth in agricultural programming, it's building width in it, that you find more access to agriculture in different sectors. We've called for in our advocacy for greater work integrated learning, that you see a computer scientist do a placement with an R&D firm in ag, or with a startup app in ag, or even at the farm level, because you find that those skill sets, when introduced to the challenges present, you have a different way of thinking and a different ability there. So I've met a number of people in doing this work, and the innovation coming from some young folks that have built incredible technology, whether it be in image recognition at the University of Winnipeg, or out in Halifax to see a robotic weeder that's able to recognize weed versus a plant. Applying those different skill sets in the sector is really where you see that that increase in applicability.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, JP, key trends that you're seeing.
Well, I don't have much to add. Maybe I will just focus on health and sustainability. I do think that if you look at what FCC has done in recent years with, revamping our venture capital strategy and working with 5 different funds, I believe, in the last couple of years, and you really look where some success has been reached, it's on the health and sustainability front. Certainly, the way that we're able to bring more product innovations to consumer, because that's one of the things that we haven't focused on really today, is really the shift in the sophistication of consumers. I do see this as a good thing, because it opens up different possibilities at the farm level. It's no longer just a single model that will allow you to be successful at the farm level, whereas in the past, 10, 20 years ago, it was, grow bigger and bigger, and that lower your cost of production. And that was the main focus. And I do believe that, there are some farms that, that still see this as a fitting model. And absolutely, in some cases, if producing a commodity and then reaching that scale of production that allows you to be the most competitive, that's, if it works for some farms. And for some other farms, it's meeting those more sophisticated food preferences of consumers. And to do that, again, it's taken this entire broad supply chain view. You can't have producers at the farm level investing in developing characteristics of raw products that are valued at the consumption level if we're not making sure that this identity of the farm product is preserved throughout, and the quality or characteristics that are valued at the consumer level are preserved throughout, right? So it requires new ways to work between farmers, processors, and retailers. We're seeing a whole lot of that some now, and I do think that's driven mostly by sort of this focus on health and sustainability at the consumer level. Another key trend I'd say, and we did mention that, though, data is definitely something to emphasize. Andrew talked about data at the farm level. I can point out a few things that are happening at the processing level as well. The power of predictive analytics has helped a lot of food processors with improving their process. And so if you have continuous flow of production and you're clear about your KPIs, your key performance indicators, and you bring in the labor and the technology, IT, that is required to make it work for you, I've seen a lot of gains there for some food processors that have been involved, that have been able to invest in harnessing the power of data for their operations. And so I think that would be other key trends to monitor in the future.
Yeah, definitely. The big data topic comes up a lot, and certainly artificial intelligence is often attached to it. Big data and AI, we hear a lot about. And I find that the conversation a lot tends to be very high level and buzzwordy. People throw these things around, and I think we may not always be talking about the same thing. And certainly, I found it very helpful to break it down into what exactly you're talking about, because big data and AI is really, it's kind of an approach, and you can use that approach whether you're talking about farm finances or labor productivity or yield enhancements, or, I think about our own organization in R&D, we're developing, for example, a mushroom harvesting system. We're using big data and AI, which essentially is able to photograph a mushroom bed and measure and track every single mushroom on that growing bed through time to model out when exactly is the right time to pick the mushroom, which mushroom needs to be picked. And it's the fundamental technology in the robotics and automation system that's being developed. So that is big data and AI, but it's a very focused and specific example. And I think a lot of the discussion and some of the nervousness or even fear that's generated is because people talk in generalities. And sometimes what we really mean is something more specific and tangible and perhaps acceptable in some of these things. So I see you nodding. Did you have any further comment on that?
Oh, very well said.
Yes. All right. So let's look at the next question here. So we talked earlier a little bit about business investment in R&D, and certainly we hear a lot about engaging the private sector in R&D and public-private partnerships and universities and public sector researchers and trying to bridge some of the gaps between these. So how do you think we can work to strengthen the relationships between the academic, scientific, technology community and the private sector? Andrew, did you want to comment on that one first?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I just mentioned the first thing I was going to say just a few minutes ago, that I think engagement through academia happens in the classroom. It happens outside the classroom. And in part, when we're thinking, certainly as I've been speaking a lot about that labor pathway of getting certainly young people with diverse skill sets to enter the sector, I think it's important that we build these work integrated learning, we build these diversified programs, we build many different access routes for young people to get in there. So I think we can't overlook that when we're thinking about how we collaborate with universities. And certainly this can start at our ag schools, and we have some of the best in the world. Say like a Guelph or a Dalhousie, and put this into the general awareness of their students of ag, but plug into other research programs at the university. I mean, a second point that I wanted to emphasize, and AIC is no stranger to this, and certainly the leader in identifying this, that we have a very stark difference in how R&D and innovation is funded in Canada. We have a heavy reliance on the public sector. And when we look in the States, we see kind of an opposite effect where the balance swings. Certainly some of that's from headquarters effect, where research operations may be based in the headquarters of a country. But what I think is really encouraging, and I know you all have experience in this, is the clustered approach. And that we're seeing, it has worked well elsewhere in the Netherlands and Norway. But here in Canada, we're starting to see this approach pay off a bit more. Certainly the protein supercluster, from my perspective, it's encouraging to see those linkages both with employers, but with the universities, so that you're building those talent pathways. And as I raised earlier, the risk of having foreign IP is that you don't build those skill sets that rely on those IP domestically. And certainly, I think the Agri-Food Automation and Innovation Network, which Tania, I believe you're involved with, has that same foundation of trying to build those linkages that are not just a one-off funding of one research initiative, but building the talent and skill sets that are needed. Going back to my opening remarks of, we have certainly just on the primary end of technology of agriculture, that expected shortage of people choosing careers that they can understand what they can do with an engineering degree or with biology degree, what they can do in agriculture. So having these clusters that are not just solely it has R&D at its core, but builds out into creating more collaborations across academic departments at a university, which creates access to more students, which creates more access to work integrated learning opportunities, I think is very encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. And certainly my perspective, having been involved in a number of different cluster initiatives and in the government granting system, I see the impact of the way funding models are structured and grants and things. And certainly what I see is the need for flexible funding mechanisms to include a wide range of players. So the traditional view that, you know, science and innovation happens in the academic community needs to be broadened. You know, there's a whole lot of other players in the public and private sector, as well as intermediaries and facilitators, little agencies and organizations that can help bring this together, that can play, you know, help bridge the gaps between different expertise, different types of businesses, different types of operating models. And so I see, you know, the greatest success is where you can be flexible and bring in the people you need and create the right group. So JP, did you have any further thoughts on that one?
Well, just maybe a quick couple of thoughts. I mean, I do think that the relationship between academia and the private sector has evolved over the years, especially in the agri-food sector. I reflect on my first 10 professional years. Now it's easier for me to look back, and because I started my career in academia for 10 years, and you know, looking back, I just, you know, a little bit struggling to understand why we, you know, both groups, you know, if you think of academia and the private sector, did not understand each other's more in terms of their incentives that they face, right? There were a lot of discussions and issues at the time that could have easily be resolved if for a second everybody would be thinking about the incentives of the different groups and how to align all that together to commercialize innovation and bring innovation to market. Now, having said that, I also, perhaps for the reasons that Andrew was talking about in terms of where the funding for R&D comes from in Canada, we perhaps need to have a little bit of a conversation around IP. You know, if you expect to split IP three ways, you know, government, academia, and private sector, you may run into some issues in terms of expecting now the private sector to commercialize the innovation and take on the risks of bringing that innovation to market, whereas you know, there may be a misunderstanding a little bit with the different partners in terms of the incentives, again, you know, post innovation and that commercialization stage. I think one of the things in Canada, we're good at a lot of good, you know, we do a lot of good things. We're great at a lot of things, but one of the things that we're perhaps lagging behind some of our competitors is the ability to market. From a marketing standpoint, in terms of pushing innovation out the door to market, whether it's domestic or foreign, I do think that might be a little bit of support that we need there. So just to guide businesses through the different partnerships, different resources that exist out there, I think that might be a gap that we need to fill to help out, you know, sort of step up our game when it comes to marketing and having a little bit more commercial success in bringing those innovations to market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the issue of IP is an interesting one. So you said we need to have a bit of a conversation around that. What is that conversation? What would that conversation look like? Who would we need to bring to the table?
Well, I do think that we need to define what leadership is in the space of R&D. And if it's coming from the public space, and I'm no expert in public policy, I have to admit that right up front, but if it's coming from the public space, you know, in terms of R&D support, then we have to have a conversation about what that leadership looks like and the role of government in sort of sorting out the IP issues going forward, and how we're partnering and establishing those partnerships. I do think there are some questions that deserve to be studied there. Not sure, I don't have the solutions. If the solutions were easy, I suspect that we wouldn't be having this discussion. But I do think that, you know, having the conversations, establishing what leadership means in funding R&D, investing in innovation, I do think that's the starting point.
Mm-hmm. Great. So one last question. So say if I was a small company with a technology, a new robot or some data app that could apply to the agriculture sector, and I wanted to know how to get into this space, what would you suggest as a piece of advice for this small company? Who should they go to for support and advice in moving into the agricultural space? Andrew?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and certainly as an outsider to the industry, it's something that struck me observing is how many different industry groups and public sector groups are working towards similar ends in this space, and can be very challenging to navigate. I think we've observed across the country a number of incubators that have been created that are facilitating this work. Certainly, I've seen it in the Fraser Valley, in the prairies, in Guelph, obviously, and certainly these localized networks are being created, which is fascinating and wonderful to see. But I think it becomes, with all these unique interests, unique needs, it becomes increasingly hard to collaborate and gain the needed scale. Think about a solution that can help primary producers. You know, the sector is comprised of 250,000 entrepreneurs, which at one level, this impacts the purchasing power, the ability to get into that space, the ability to incubate new ideas, and also risk-taking. On the other hand, it allows a bit more of piloting, a little bit more of working with one-on-one, of trying to find a new solution, which is exciting. What we've heard from our clients is that as they're adopting new technology, they're expecting a shorter payback period of any investment they make. And this puts the business decisions under greater stress. So finding a new technology, it really needs to be vetted and proven before they're willing to make that investment, as they may know something could replace it very quickly. So what we've heard from our clients is that many of them are making those decisions on when a technology is proven, how to buy it, is usually through the vendors. So their local seed or equipment dealers have become very powerful in the way that they're shaping the knowledge diffusion around what's available. Sometimes that's tied to what they're offering. Sometimes it may be informed by what's available across the market. But, you know, we both, JP and I, come from financial institutions. And I think it's also important to highlight the role here that they play. When we survey our clients about the role of their account manager, about helping them improve the profitability of their operations, about a quarter of them said that these account managers were seen as being invested in the success and growth of their business. So I think bottom line, it would be beneficial to have some facilitation in this space. That there's a big gulf between the consumer and the innovator right now, and I think having those pathways outlined for them would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. JP?
Absolutely. I concur. I do think that inventors and innovators need support, customized support. In a lot of cases, I mean, what I hear is that they can't park everything in an accelerator for 2 years because they have other things on the go, and so they need this customized support. And so who's going to take leadership for this is really, I think, a question that we all have to sort out and ask ourselves and find some solutions. I do think that there are plenty of resources available. Sometimes there's just an unawareness or lack of awareness around, you know, what is available, how to guide those different steps. And really, I think the inventors and innovators that have had the most success are really the ones that have a CEO type mentality, that are able to form the strategic partnership, whether it's with their suppliers, you know, or financial institutions and or other businesses and segments of the supply chain that are connected to their business. I do think that's one of the critical ways in terms of, you know, making sure that you have success being an innovator. But I do think that there might be a role for something that sort of gathers and assemble and brings clarity to what are the resources available to spur innovation, guide innovators to commercial success.
Yeah, so kind of a concierge service to help people find their way. Yeah. Okay, so we have around 20 minutes left now of this session where we can take some questions from the participants. And I think, Serge, I'm going to pass this section to you to moderate, and then I can join in as one of the panelists and help answer some of the questions. You're right to do that?
I am. Thank you very
Great.
much. Thank you very much, Tania. Much appreciated. And thank you to the panelists so far. We've got a few questions from the audience, and this is great. The first question from Ian Potter. innovation is a very complex issue that, as has been discussed, and it can happen in many different places. In the context of innovation by agriculture companies, such as growers and food processor and beyond, do you think that they have the ability to innovate within, and are they generally aware of the many government mechanisms to support them? Good question. JP.
I really do think that they have the ability to innovate within. I mean, if you spend time, I mean, I think one of the focus that we have at FCC is to shift the mindset from, when it comes to farm management, I did use the term, CEO type mentality. So do you think that, we have a lot to gain in shifting that mindset to becoming a CEO on the farm, right? So I know many agricultural producers, and they like to spend their time out in the field for good reasons. Believe me, I'd love to do that this afternoon myself. But when we think of a CEO, right, any type of CEO, both Andrew and I, as Andrew's mentioned, we work for a financial institution. If we think of our CEOs, they're not the most expert in all the different fields that a financial institution is at, right? So there's not going to be a CEO is not going to be an expert in human resources. Is not going to be an expert in marketing. Is not going to be the expert in financial management and so forth, right? But the idea of the CEO is to surround himself or herself with qualified people to help implement the strategy on the farm, right? And I do think that we're at that stage. I mean, you think of farming in Canada, I do think that we're at that stage that we have to step up our game in terms of what is it to be really a CEO on my farm, and step away from the doing and really make sure that I have this network of resources around me. And I do know that, and I do think that, we can do it within the business, and that we have the ability to do so. We just need to shift the focus and the mindset a little bit, in my opinion.
I appreciate, and I certainly appreciate your wishes to be outside on the farm right now. It's about 24 degrees in Ottawa, so your wishes are shared. Andrew.
Yeah, no, I think the study that we did, we try to look at the 4 generations of change. So obviously former 4.0, we tried to think about how these different generations of change happen. And what we observe even today in the 4th industrial revolution, you see a lot of bottom-up transformation and innovation. You think of the farm management software programs that have been developed came from the farm. So absolutely, I concur that there is the ability to innovate within, to adapt new things. But the second question of whether there's the awareness of the supports around them to facilitate these, that goes to our last point. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that is such a challenging environment to navigate for many, especially as a small firm. To use that CEO mentality too, you need it also with that team around you. And I keep going back to the idea of skills, but I think when we're thinking at the farm level, there needs to be that availability of skills to work with these new practices and technology. So yeah, that's a great question.
Great. Tania.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea about, innovating within companies is absolutely possible. There's less capacity than perhaps we would hope for, but it's possible. One thing that we've certainly observed, though, is there's a need to support the companies, especially in terms of de-risking in any moves they want to make. So, for example, if you have a technology that is a company that supplies a technology into another sector, and we're trying to get them to move over into agriculture. As agriculture, the need for technology grows and we adopt technologies from other industries, some of these companies and suppliers need to be introduced to the agriculture sector, but that's a risky move from a business perspective. They need that move to be de-risked. They need support in that. They need information. They need, perhaps some funding to help bridge that gap and to try some things. So I think, it can be done. I think there's a lot of support out there, but it comes back to our last discussion point, the need for these support organizations and perhaps a concierge service or some support in pointing them to the right direction.
Great. Thank you very much, Tania. And I'm going to jump around from question to question. The next question I would like answered, and I'm going to ask participants to to have shorter answers if possible, so we can actually get through all the questions. And this is great to have so many of them, by the way. I'm going to jump to Samuel Bonti and Coma's question, which is, how do we explain the low innovation and technology adoption rate in Canada? Is it because we are a small market, and do you think Canada is better placed to adopt rather than actual innovate? Will that be more cost effective? And Mr. Bonti-Ancoma is with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And a couple of years ago, he came to one of our conferences and said something that was fantastic, is that the return on investment for agri-food research and innovation is the highest amongst the different sectors that he has studied. So I'm quite interested in that question and the answers. Andrew.
Yeah, and that question reminded me of a conversation I had with some of our clients in the Fraser Valley when they're bean producers, long green bean producers. And they said that they buy their equipment from used equipment from Washington state producers, because the farms across the border are about 5 or 6 times the size of theirs. And they were able to, the US farms were able to operate on the newest, shiniest tools. And so for ability for our producers there to adopt the technology was a scale issue. And I think for many people across the country, many producers, that is a real challenge of having a very different scale than folks in other countries.
Great. JP?
Well, it's a great public policy question. I'm not so sure that I have a great answer for this, but you know, in theory, I mean, it could be more cost effective, especially if we have an environment, a framework that regulates how pricing of innovation is done within the borders, right? But in reality, I'm not so convinced that it'll be more cost effective if we are just sitting on the sidelines and adopt innovation. I have, you know, I don't have any evidence one way or the other. I'm just asking the questions myself, you know, and great public policy question. I do think though that the correlation between R&D investment and GDP is definitely present in our sector. So I would like for us to be able to carry through the research, investment, research, and innovation.
Great, Tania?
The adoption question's a big one, and I'm not sure there's one easy fix to it. I think, Andrew, you touched on it earlier with, you know, often the adoption of technology requires huge capital investment from farmers, which may or may not be feasible. We also see issues of, you know, people's bias towards technologies coming out of Europe, for example, and a lack of belief that Canadian companies can supply what they need. So there's a lot of gaps to bridge there and in encouraging adoption. And I think we can probably tackle it with a multi-pronged kind of approach.
Great, and I noticed that there is another question on the on suggestions to improve the adoption of academic research innovation by the agri-food sector. I would advise to go on our website, on the AIC website. I think we did a report a couple of years ago, 3 years ago actually, on just that, the dissemination of academic research in the agri-food sector. I'll move to the question from Karen, which I think could be addressed by everyone, Karen Spencer. And basically talking about the growth rate slowing down, which was mentioned by JP. And her question is, are we looking at something that will continue to slow down? Are we going to a flatter growth rate, or will there be material breakthrough? And if so, where do you see them? Genomics, manufacturing, where? Let's start by Tania in this case.
That's a crystal ball gazing kind of question. I think the slowdown is a big long-term global phenomena, and I think I think, it depends perhaps on your outlook. I see incremental improvements technologies can bring. My inclination is that the slowdown is a longer term thing that's here to stay, and we're going to have a slower growth in future. I don't think that we can keep expanding and growing at the rates we've seen in the past century, for example. I think automation's a big one. Genetics can always be improved and give us gains in all kinds of areas. But I also have faith in human ingenuity in coming up with something perhaps that we haven't even thought of now.
Great. Andrew?
Yeah. I think about how Canada recovered out of the financial crisis, and certainly we should expect another period of slow growth. Certain commodity prices are a big part of that. So purchasing power across the economy is probably going to be not as strong as we'd like it to be. But the fact is that, as JP and I illustrated at the top, is the sector was anticipating a slower productivity growth and by factor less room for output growth at the same time. And, part of that has been fueled by the continued or pervasive job vacancies across the industry. And going forward, if we don't solve the pipeline issue of getting people into the sector, there isn't the ability to propel new growth in the skill sets, among the skill sets that the industry desires to fuel that growth through productivity that is reliant on adoptions of new practices, technologies, and science.
Great. JP, please.
Well, I'm going to make a stand. I'm going to say we can revert it. All right. So here you go. It's going to be hard, right? I mean, Tania, you were talking about dynamics, automation, data would be another one that I think can do it. But fact of the matter is we almost don't have really much of a choice, because if you look at the last 10 years of available data, we're growing productivity in the ag sector at around 0.5%. I mean, so the idea is we're not only slowing, but we're lagging competitors. And so I think for the future success of the industry, that's critical. And that's not an easy message to hear if you're in the industry and you're thinking, well, I've invested so many dollars in my operation. I've done so many things to be competitive, and my margins are shrinking, because that's what we hear, right? And so that's not a message easy to hear, because, the industry feels that they've done a whole lot, and that's true. But the reality is that the competitive pressures are going to continue to increase, and we just need to step up. And there's really a big challenge for all of us, but I really do think that we can deliver on that.
Great. Thank you very much, JP. We're going to take one more question from those that have been asked, and then we'll have the closing comments. I'll go to Mitchell Japp's question. When I look at agricultural demographics, he sees a high average age compared to the general workforce. But how does it compare to other industries where the owner is the owner of $1 million or a multi-million-dollar business? When comparing farmers over 70 to farmers under 35, I think those under 35 are limited because of capital restrictions to enter. It takes time to generate that capital. For those that do generate the capital at a young age, I'm guessing that they will have a much larger farm size than the average farmer over 70. But what we're looking at is, are we really having a crisis on the farm, or is it to be expected that the farmers are older because they have a huge amount of capital and it takes time to build that? JP.
Well, I don't think we're facing a crisis. I don't want to downplay the challenges. Ag has always been a capital-intensive industry, right? It's true that now land, which is one, if not the most essential input into agricultural production, is the most expensive or least affordable it's ever been. But if you look at net entrance in the industry, according to the last survey, we have a positive rate of entry by people aged 35 and under. So I think that's a pretty good sign. And yes, it is difficult for young producers to establish the equity, and I do, the traditional farming system of building equity is still a very successful business model, but there are other business models as well, right? I was talking about scale at some point, saying that, you know, it's not just about being large and low cost. I mean, there are different types of models there that I've seen younger farmers adopt and embrace. And so despite the fact that, yes, it's a little hard, it's harder now to get in the industry and establish that scale of production to make it efficient, especially if you look at an ownership model. I do think that there's some positive outlook for the industry overall.
Great. Quick response, Andrew.
Well, no, it's an interesting take on it, but I think the reality remains that you know, the average age, there is a stark difference when you think about construction, and among tradespeople who are owning their own businesses, you see a stark difference. You see about an average age of 42 versus average age of 55. So there is definitely a demographic trend here. JP raises an excellent point that different business models can create that. We've seen a trend towards more business incorporation, which I think will help with some of those capital questions of access into the market. I think also, as we've seen with female farmers coming on board, that more success with land lease arrangements. So there's certainly exciting access points to the industry, but I don't think we should overlook that it is among our sectors one of the oldest, both in terms of duration, but also of experience. So we need to be considering that as time goes on.
Thank you. And Tania, a couple of words?
No, I think I'll leave that one to the economists and the bankers.
All right. Well, thank you so much, all of you, JP, Andrew, and Tania, for having moderated and being a panel member for this session. A very interesting discussion, and thank you to the attendees for the interesting question. I want to remind everyone that November 17th, at the same time, we will tackle the next topic, which is there an investment gap for agri-food research and innovation? We have 4 panelists, Laurie Dimitrian, Chief of Equity Investment at Peak Investments, Lynn Godlian, CEO at Perenia Food and Agriculture, Dave Smarden, President and CEO at Bioenterprise, and Alison Sundstrom, Founder and CEO, CNSRVX Incorporated. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and I want to wish you a great rest of the day, and hopefully see you next week on behalf of AIC. Thank you.